Good morning. Happy Monday. I have Neuro Coffee in hand and it is perfect. All right. Got a big week coming up. I work in 2-week sprints, so this is a pretty heavy duty week, but it should be good. So we're going to dig into this Q&A that I've been putting off a little bit because I had to shoot some video that goes with it. So there's probably going to be like some video here, or we'll just cut it in and out. I don't know. I'll figure it out. I'm not technically inclined, but I'll figure out a solution here for you. The question comes from Josh, and Josh says, are there variations of the Camporini Deadlift? I feel like I've seen where the front toes are elevated, the back heel is elevated, the ipsilateral is loaded, or the contralateral arm is loaded. Can you explain when you would use these variations? And yes, Josh, yes, I can. But let's talk about why we would want to select this exercise in the first place. What we don't want to do is blindly prescribe exercises. We want to have a good reasoning behind our thought process. And so what we're talking about here is an asymmetrical variation of a deadlift that is somewhat similar to like a single leg deadlift, but we've got a double foot contact. And what this allows us to do is it allows us to reorient the sacrum like the rudder on a boat. And if we have a situation where we're missing this middle part of middle propulsion, so we can actually divide middle propulsion into segments as well. And so if I break out the foot here, this middle range of propulsion is when the foot is going to come down to flat, and it's where we have this tibial translation over the foot. And so we can bias, and we can say that this is the earliest phase of middle propulsion and this is the end phase of middle propulsion. And through that phase is where we're going to see a lot of nutation of the sacrum. We're going to see a lot of internal rotation of the hip. And some folks are missing some of that because of the inability, I should say, to orient the sacrum appropriately. Because of some strategies that they're using in the pelvis and then the bias of the foot. But this is going to affect everything from all of your activities where you need some form of nutation, like your deadlifts, your kettlebell swings, powerlifting style squats, half kneeling, or even split stance activities. So this is kind of a big deal for a lot of people, but this is a really, really useful exercise thanks to our good friend Mike Camporini for experimenting in the gym and working on this. But so what we want to do is we want to alleviate the bias that's putting us at one end of this middle propulsive phase. And so we can describe this with our pelvis a little bit. And so essentially what we're talking about is this bias of the sacrum being biased in one direction or the other by this orientation of the pelvis. And so if somebody is biased towards the early phase of this mid propulsion, typically what you're going to see is somebody that can probably squat to parallel, but when they do a hinging exercise, they look like they can hinge, but you'll see a little bit of a shift off to one side or the other. They can typically flex their hip past 90 degrees, and you're typically going to have a reasonably good straight leg raise. So it'll probably be 70 degrees or more. If we look at somebody that's biased towards this later stage of the middle propulsion, so this is right before max propulsion, these are typically going to be people that don't squat well to parallel. You're going to see hip flexion that's less than 90 degrees. You're going to see a very limited straight leg raise, in some cases 45 degrees or less. And that's because they've got this additional compressive strategy in this lower aspect on the posterior side of the pelvis. So these people are really pushed forward in one direction. And again, because of this concentric orientation of the musculature below the trochanter there. And so again, that's how we're going to divide this up. We're going to see somebody that's a little bit more compressed at the base, and then we're going to see somebody that has a lot more compressive strategy that's getting pushed way over in that late propulsive strategy. And so when we're talking about how we want to modify this, we have two influences. We can go from the ground up and we can go from the top down. And so when we talk about the ground up, this is where our foot bias comes in, Josh. And so we can talk about biasing the foot towards this early phase of propulsion. So if I have somebody that's biased way towards late, so this is the person with the limited straight leg raise, hip flexion, can't squat very deep, I want to bias that foot towards its early strategy. And so this is where I'm going to elevate the heel. And so what that does is it moves that tibia backwards, and that puts me in this early phase of this middle propulsion. So now what I want to start to think about, not just elevating the heel, but I also want to consider where I'm putting the load. So I'm going to put the load on the contralateral side. So let's just say that if we look at the video, we're going to say that the left hip is the affected hip that we're trying to influence. We're trying to move that hip towards an earlier phase of propulsion. I'm going to put the weight on the contralateral side. And what this is going to do is it's going to allow me to use the weight to create the reorientation. So I'm actually turning my thorax into the left side. I'm actually turning the sacrum to the left side by putting the weight on the contralateral side. So that's going to push me back towards my left back pocket. And so now I have a bias from the ground up. So I bias myself into early, and I've turned myself into the left side. So now I've really reoriented that sacrum. So the couple of cues that you might want to remember is make sure that you're inhaled before you descend, and make sure you're exhaling up from the bottom. So again, we're going to try to reinforce this nutation with the exhalation from the ground up. Now, if I am early biased, so this is going to be the person that has decent hip flexion, decent straight leg raise, and can probably squat to parallel, I'm going to flip-flop that foot orientation. So I'm going to put the toes up and the heel down, and what that's going to do, it's going to move that tibia forward into that later stage of the middle propulsive phase of gait, or wherever I may need to utilize that for my hinging activities. And so now I've got that ground up influence. And again, because I want to reorient that sacrum, I'm going to keep the weight on the contralateral side. As you can see, hopefully in this video here, if I'm technically sound enough to put the video in the right place. So now, when do we switch the weight over to the ipsilateral side, or the same side as the affected hip, if you will? Under those circumstances, this will be after I've recaptured the hip range of motion deficits that I was trying to reacquire. So in this case, I'm going to see an improvement in my hip flexion, my straight leg raise, my squat, and I'm going to recapture the internal rotation through that full middle propulsive phase. But if I look at the opposite hip now, so where we were talking about the left hip before, we're going to talk about the right hip now. If I'm missing external rotation in the opposite hip, in this case the right hip, now I'm going to flip-flop the weight to the ipsilateral side. Reason being is I want to push with that opposite side back into the left hip to actually delay the propulsive strategies that I have just reacquired on this left side. And what this is going to do, it's going to restore my right hip external rotation. So if I have a deficit in external rotation on the opposite hip, that's how I know when to switch the weight over to the ipsilateral side. Now, a little trick here, you got to be really, really careful, because the weight will try to reorient you back into the old strategy. So we have to actually resist this. So as you can see in the video, I'm maintaining that left posterior expansion throughout the lift to make sure that I'm not losing the ability to delay that propulsive strategy on the left side. So now we understand the foot bias, we understand the technique, and we understand how to manipulate the load. So Josh, I hope that answers your questions for you. It was a great question. Just took me a while to get to it because I had to shoot some extra video. But like I said, hopefully that takes care of it. If you have more questions, please send them to askbillhartman@gmail.com, and I will see you guys later.